I'm from Argentina, and I finished my PhD in Argentina. And because of that, I know Daniel Cardinale. And maybe the first time I learned about melatonin and the pineal gland is from Daniel, because I remember when I was a graduate student in Argentina, he came and gave a seminar soon after he came back from the United States, being in Dick Burman's lab. Yeah. And at the same time, I should say that I believe it was 1974, 2 years into my PhD, that we had the visit of Julie Axelrod and into our institute, and I remember that very well.
Which institute was this?
Institute of Pharmacological Investigations, Institute of Pharmacological Investigations, and that was an institute that was set for Sol Langer, who was my advisor. And it was interesting because that institute was, had a lot of funds or resources at that time, because at that time in Argentina, about 1% of all the profits from medicines would go to research. So, but that was at that time, and then after, everything, went down. But anyway, I think that that's my first connection, and for me, knowing what the pineal gland was and maybe melatonin. And then when I graduated, I left Argentina with my advisor. We went to Burroughs Wellcome in England, and he became the chair of pharmacology there. It was at the time that John Bain was the vice president for research, and was at the time that they discovered prostacyclin. We were just next door to the lab at the time. So I'm really very much into pharmacology and receptors and drug discovery, if you want. So, but before we left, a couple of years before, I was not involved in the project, but my advisor and Jaime Echeverry was another scientist there. They started working in the pineal gland, and I think that they wanted to look at presynaptic receptors in the pineal gland, because that was the area that I was training, presynaptic receptors. So
it was a marvelous model for receptors.
Yes, exactly. So when we were moved to London in 1976, and we were in Burroughs Wellcome, but only 6 months after that we arrived, my advisor, Sol Langer, got a job in Paris to work as a head of biology in Cintelabo. Right. And then there was a postdoc that came from Spain, Francisco Pelayo, and one of the projects that were given to him, and also under my supervision, was to look at presynaptic receptors in the pineal gland. And then we were interested in the alpha and the beta adrenoceptors. Was at the time when Marty Zatt was working with Julie Axelrod in the United States. And I remember that Marty Zatt was working in the role of cyclic GMP on alpha adrenoceptors. So we were also testing some of those hypotheses in the presynaptic receptors, the alpha and beta presynaptic receptors in the pineal gland. Mm-hmm. And this is the work I presented in the Jerusalem meeting in 1977.
Oh, yes, we all remember that.
And then is there where I met at that meeting, I met for the first time Marty Zatt, and I met Julie Axelrod. I had met him before in Argentina, and vaguely remember, I think that vaguely remember David Klein, but I don't know. And then I think that I met also there PV maybe, but I don't know. I don't have much recollection, but I remember the dinner with the Prime Minister. Yeah, yes. And then I remember also from the head from Egypt was Sadat coming to Israel. So I remember that very vividly.
Very striking.
Yeah, very very striking. So I presented that work there.
1977 was a very important moment in this field.
Exactly.
For a lot of people.
And then actually, I think that that trip, actually perhaps I am now doing melatonin receptors and circadian rhythms because I was at that meeting. And it occurs me right now why. I took an excursion. We went in a tour around Israel. Masada and yeah. So and were you there?
Yes.
In the tour in the bus?
Yes.
Where Daniel Cardinali
Yes.
was? Of course, we probably have plenty of pictures together.
Yes.
And I sat all the time by Daniel. And remember when we were to the kibbutz and all those things?
Yes.
Yeah. So I had to find the pictures because I'm sure you were there. And then Daniel Cardinali was sitting by me, and then so we talked a lot. And I remember that, I don't remember, I think that was during this trip one evening, I remember like it is today. He said, well, you've been with your advisor for a long time. It's time for you to do something else. And I was very loyal to my advisor at the time, and I never viewed myself like going away or doing something else. So Daniel said, in another thing, he said, look, I like your data. Why don't you try melatonin to see whether melatonin inhibits norepinephrine release? Because these were presynaptic receptors in the noradrenergic nerves. I said, well, that would be interesting, but I have to ask Sol, that's Sol Langer, whether he thinks that is okay. And then, I was very loyal. I wouldn't do anything that is not what he was saying. So I went back and I said, Sol, I was talking to Daniel, and then he said that maybe we should try melatonin to see whether it inhibits dopamine release. Norepinephrine release. And then he said, it's not going to work because we tried serotonin and it didn't work. Well, I said, that's not a very good reason. As I said, I just forgot about that. So I stayed there, came back and forgot about the whole story. And we finished the paper that we were writing, and we published it in Nature. It was alpha-2 and beta-2 presynaptic receptors on adrenergic nerve terminals in the pineal gland.
Was that your first really big paper?
No, I have several other papers. I have papers when I was in Argentina. I have I have papers in British Journal of Pharmacology, JPET, Journal of Physiology. Actually, we have 2 papers in Journal of Physiology, and believe it or not, the second paper in the Journal of Physiology was accepted without revisions when we were in Argentina. Can you believe that?
That is miraculous.
I don't know. It was a paper on the effect of prostaglandins on presynaptic receptors, something like that. Well, Sol Langer was writing he had a very, very excellent English because he trained it at Harvard in the United States and also in Cambridge, UK. But then it was amazing. So the other paper in J. Physiol was the paper that set up the stage for the classification of the alpha receptors into the alpha-1 and the alpha-2. And then subsequent to that paper, Sol Langer wrote a review, and he proposed the nomenclature alpha-2 presynaptic, alpha-1 postsynaptic. And we were the first in setting up that difference. There were some other people around the world that also viewed the same, more or less at the same time, but this was the first time that was said in a review. And then I went back to Paris and then worked in some other things. And then in 1980, I moved to Denver, Colorado, okay? And I developed on my own a method to measure dopamine release from the retina. And I look at presynaptic receptors, I look at the dopamine presynaptic receptors, and I look at the alpha receptors. And it was at this time when, after 2 years there, I got the job as an assistant professor at Northwestern University. And I've been there 25 years. This was 1982. So when I got to Northwestern, I was going to do transmitter release. That was the only thing, more or less, I knew how to do. And I was going to continue with my work in the retina. And I have gotten a grant from the Eye Institute to do dopamine release and presynaptic receptors, no mention of melatonin. But, so I had done also dopamine presynaptic and alpha-2 presynaptic. And then when I got to Chicago, I was setting up my lab. I got a technician to do these experiments, and at the same time, the FASEB meeting was in Chicago that next year, next April, and I had been invited by Mike Ubon and Becharge to talk at the symposium they were organizing on the retina. Indole means in the retina. And my knowledge of melatonin from Cardinali and the 1977 meeting, and also I have heard people were talking at the time about melatonin being in the retina. So then I said, for some reason I bought melatonin, and I bought serotonin, and I bought a number of other drugs to have in my lab. And I said, well, I'm invited to talk in this symposium. I have dopamine receptors, I have alpha receptors. Wouldn't that be nice to have all the indolamines? And then that will be serotonin, okay? So the day I was going to do the experiment, I would do electrical stimulation, dopamine release, put melatonin, or put a drug to inhibit. So I got to the refrigerator and I said, I'm going to do serotonin. But rather than taking serotonin, I took melatonin. But you remember what Sol Langer told me. Melatonin is not going to work because serotonin didn't work. So I took melatonin, and I normally used to try these drugs at 10 to the minus 7. This is 100 nanomolar or 1 micromolar. I tried those doses, and it completely inhibited. So I thought that something went wrong, that there was no stimulation or something. I tried again. And I started lowering and lowering and lowering and lowering until I got to 10 to the minus 12. That still had an effect. Well, I have a beautiful dose-response curve, and that ended up in this Nature paper that I have in 1983. And I keep it to myself. But then I said I was not going to report it at the meeting because it was too exciting. I just wanted to write the paper. I said, now I have to try serotonin. I need to talk about serotonin because I have dopamine receptors and alpha receptors. Believe it or not, it didn't work. So if I have gotten, in first time serotonin, I may have been discouraged for...
You might never have tried that.
I may have never tried. And that was the reason I am saying this 1977 meeting maybe had something to do in my mind of how happened. So because I'm a pharmacologist, I knew I have something very exciting there, and that was a way to try a functional receptors. In pharmacology, most of the drugs in the past, everything that done by Jim Black and then all the giants of receptors and people who discovered drugs, they did it they didn't have receptor binding or things like that. They did functional work. So I knew all that. So I started working and doing, functional studies. People were very skeptical because, as you remember at the time, people didn't believe that there were melatonin receptors in mammals. Yeah, at the time that we discovered that melatonin was extremely effective to inhibit dopamine release, there was no evidence whatsoever in mammals that there were melatonin receptors that were functional. Binding sites don't represent a functional receptor. So being a pharmacologist, I understood that demonstrated the presence of a functional receptor using this functional model was essential. And that's how I went into showing a structural activity relationship and using classical pharmacological concepts to understand which were the components of the melatonin molecule that were essential to activate the receptor. And based on that, in conjunction with a company called Nelson Research at the time, we synthesized the first melatonin, a competitive melatonin receptor antagonist, Luzendol, and we based exactly in that structural activity relationship because we knew if we removed the 5-methoxy group, we would have a compound with lower efficacy. And this was already demonstrated in the frog by Higor and Hadley, which shows that N-acetyltryptamine was a putative antagonist. So we show this in humans and in the retina that luzindol was an antagonist. So we could start asking the questions: what's the physiological role of melatonin? When we went into, I was after an antagonist because I thought that having an antagonist that will block the effect of endogenous melatonin, you would mimic light. And that's why I named luzindol. Luz is light in Spanish, indol is the name of the molecule. So that's what I have now, that's what I wanted to synthesize, to have a melatonin antagonist. Unfortunately, in all these years, we have been unable to show in mammals that luzindol actually blocks the effect of endogenous melatonin. But I think that it's not that it would not happen. In a recent paper in Science, Oliver Rauwosdesh in the lab of Greg Calhill showing the zebrafish that luzindol, in fact, can, giving alone into the zebrafish, can then potentiate the ability of the animals to learn. And that's the first demonstration that, luzindol is doing, reversing the effect of endogenous melatonin at night. So one thing brought the other, and then also in collaboration with my colleague and friend Alan Horn, who was in the Netherlands at the time, in Groningen, I met him again seems that Jerusalem is the place where I made all my discoveries. I met him in a meeting, catecholamine meetings in 1987, and I was telling him about our discoveries with luzindol, and then he subsequently sent me a couple of compounds to test, and those turns out to be the 4-PP dot series. And then we started a very interesting collaboration, and it came up, resulted in another patent. The luzindol was patented, and the patent on 4-PP dot, and this is the one that subsequently was auctioned by Glaxo at the time. So we started a collaboration with Glaxo that lasted 5 years. In which I was doing all the screening and all the testing of the melatonin compounds for Glaxo, and then I started the collaboration, and then they, little by little, they started developing their own technology in-house. It was very unfortunate that Alan Horn died in a car accident just before we entered into collaboration with Glaxo. But anyway, I forgot to mention that before this, in 1985, Joe Takahashi and I synthesized 2-iodomelatonin following the paper by Bakuri at Northwestern University. And I tested it in the cheek retina, and the first day, the first experiment I did, with the first conditions I set up, the experiment worked, and we got an enormous amount of specific binding. So that's how we start then testing compounds using primarily the chicken retina to look at the binding sites, and primarily the rabbit retina to look at the function. And that's how I was able to test compounds for Glaxo. And when we had 2-iodomelatonin in 1987, soon after we started working with 2-iodomelatonin, we tested in the hamster brain, and we tested in the chicken retina, and I saw immediately that the pharmacology was different, and that's when I postulated in a FACET journal paper review in 1988 that there were two different distinct binding sites that have different pharmacological and kinetic properties. And that's one was in the hamster and the other was in the chicken retina. And
now this appears to be very important from the point of view of biological rhythms in terms of function.
But that was the ML1 and ML2. And then when the receptors were cloned, it was shown that the ML2 was an entity, which is now the MT3. And the ML1 turns out to be the ML1A and ML1B that subsequently the nomenclature committee of IOFAR for melatonin receptors named the receptors MT1 and MT2. Okay. Now, at the same time, in the 87 or something like that, I had a new postdoc join my lab. That was Marilyn Duncan, who came from a lab doing photoperiodic work, and she knew quite a bit in circadian rhythms. So we started looking at rhythms in the late 1997, 1998, and we looked at circadian rhythms because we wanted to know whether melatonin and the melatonin antagonist would have some effects on these rhythms. Now, when the receptors were cloned in 1994, then we start looking at the different pictures. Now we have the ML2 and the ML1 that now were ML1A, ML1B, MT1, MT2. So the new classification of melatonin receptors came into place. Then I have other people in the lab that were interested in circadian rhythms, and then we generated the first phase response curve in the C3H mice, both for light and melatonin. And when I generated that phase response curve, when we tried to shift the rhythms based on the rat PRC using one dose of melatonin, it didn't work. So I remember very vividly the minute I walked into the lab and I told Susan Van Lucil, I said, Susan, what we have to do is the same thing that Al is doing in humans. We have to do 4 injections. And it was in that moment that she went and did the PRC to 3 injections or 3 doses of melatonin when start working, and that's how we generated the PRC.
Was this a melatonin proficient mouse?
Yes, and then that's another thing that in 1985 I had a colleague that came from Poland to look at actually the effect of Luzindol on the swimming test, because my idea was that melatonin at the time may promote depression. So we wanted to test Luzindol that was mimicking light in our minds to see whether we have an antidepressant-like effect. And again, here she came, and then we were, that was Eva Molivnica, and then we tried to then test Luzindol, and then she was looking into the type of mice that we were going to use. And at the time, Mike Menaker had published a paper on the C57 that didn't have melatonin in the pineal gland. Again, I remember the moment that I jumped from my seat and I said, Eva, it will not work in the C57 mice. She said, why? Because they don't have melatonin. Let's look for a mice that have melatonin. And that's how we started in 1985, working with C3H mice.
You had a potential chronobiotic in Luzindol, in fact, but it's never really got to human.
No, Luzindol probably will never get to human, but some analogs of those may be in the future. We show at the time that Luzindol has an antidepressant effect. And in fact, we are following on that because right now we are really working a lot with Luzindol again, because Luzindol, it turns out, as other antidepressants, promotes cell proliferation and neurogenesis, which is a characteristic of antidepressant drugs. Most antidepressant drugs now are known, including Prozac and all the SSRIs and actually some of the classic antidepressants, promotes neurogenesis. So because in depression, as you know, there is a death of neurons, and then antidepressants reverse that. So we have that effect with Luzindol, so it's kind of very interesting. So we are doing a lot of work right now.
Now, where do you see the field going from here, and what's your work directed towards at the moment?
Right now, as you know, I am very interested in, not only interested, but I am very much working on trying to identify which melatonin receptor mediates each physiological function, particularly on sleep and circadian rhythms. And I think that mainly for sleep, for circadian rhythms regulation, I think that has a lot to do with the levels of melatonin or the concentrations of melatonin we use or the dose of melatonin we use to activate the different receptors. The MT2 is activated by very, very, very small doses or concentrations of melatonin. So the MT1, you need higher concentrations of melatonin, and it's that range in which I think is very, very important to try to understand what endogenous melatonin do. And I think that as techniques are improved and we get more sensitivity in whatever assay we are using, we are going to see that very, very low doses of melatonin are more effective than we think they are. And you can see that from the work of Louis, in which he uses very, very diminutive amounts of melatonin, and he has these very remarkable effects. Perhaps we are still using too much melatonin. Perhaps my prediction is, and depending on the rhythm that you are looking at, my prediction is that the effect of melatonin may be even more pronounced. What happened with melatonin is that the receptors desensitize, particularly the MT2, very effectively with physiological concentrations of melatonin. So it is possible that under the conditions we are using, sometimes the receptors are completely gone. They are desensitized.
But how do you come to terms with the CSF reported levels of melatonin, which are an order of magnitude higher than the receptor
Yes,
range?
I agree with you, and I don't really know how that has to be reconciled. What probably you have to look at is how much the receptors in the SCNs of that they see of that melatonin, how much that they are exposed to. So I don't, we are measuring what is in the circulation. Once I was asked a question, whether we thought that the receptors in the SCN are exposed to the circulating melatonin or the melatonin that comes through the ventricle, and I don't think that we know that. There is another thing that I wanted to mention, and this is the importance of the role of melatonin or melatonin antagonists on depression, to treat depression. It's very remarkable that agomelatine is an antidepressant, and I think that I am not sure, and I don't think that the field is, at least pharmacologists are not sure, that all the effect of agomelatine is due to, as an antidepressant, to the 5-HT2C. And then we are wondering whether, well, of course, the alignment of sleep and circadian rhythms is important, but what else is in there? Is all the antidepressant effect due to the adjustment of circadian rhythms and sleep, what will be fantastic? Or there is an important component of the 5-HT2C. And just for the record, I just want to tell a story too. As it turns out, in the first batch of compounds that I received in 1990, from Glaxo to test, because they were sending me every 2 weeks 15 or 20 compounds for me to test in my lab. And I probably tested 600 compounds, again, in my chicken retina and in the rabbit retina dopamine release assay. So I would screen these compounds and I would send information to them. In the first batch, there was a compound that has an enormous activity both in the retina, and it was has very high affinity to compete for triiodomelatonin binding. And guess what the compound was? That was agomelatine. And I don't know whether I remember the number, and we were very, very excited about that compound, and it was one of the first compounds we tested. And so I don't know whether it would have followed through further, but after a month, and that we were very excited about this compound, I got a fax into my office, and that fax was the Servier patent application on these compounds. Of course, everything was gone at that moment. So the thing that I said, I don't really know whether we would have, actually, whether Glaxo would have continued with this or not. But the fact was that we also got it in our screen.
Tell me how hard it is to be a mother and working as an international pharmacologist in biological rhythms, and what you wish for the field in the future.
Well, I really have enjoyed very, very much my career as a scientist, and particularly in the field of melatonin. As you know, I've been for 25 years. My experience, probably as a mother, as always, I wish I spent more time with my son, but as a matter of fact, he is graduating from high school in 2 weeks. So he is in his way to college. But I really have the support of my husband, Dr. Randy Hudson, who we kind of arranged the things quite well. One would take care of the kid in the morning and the other in the afternoon. And then really to make it in any country, I think that you have to have a support of your husband and your family. And always you want to spend more time with your kids, and I wish I have done this, I have done that. But the thing is that I am not the typical mother, because when I had my son, I was quite advanced in my career. I was already a professor, and at the time, when you are at this level of your career, you have more resources, so you can just afford having your kid in all-day daycare, or having somebody at home that help you. So in that regard, I was in a privileged situation, because I could have the help that many other young women don't have. I enjoy that, and I think that being a scientist, you can you give a lot to your son, to your children, that it's a little different, so it's very enjoyable.
And what do you wish for the field?
For the field, well, I think that the field of circadian rhythms and the field of melatonin receptors have grown so much, and I think that we really, from my own experience, I wish there were more people who would be using pharmacological tools to try to understand how melatonin works, and I wish more people would look into the basics of melatonin action through receptors, because I think that there is a lot that we have to learn, much more. I cannot explain, sometimes I have these aha moments, that it just is something that it happens to me when I was looking for the species of mice, and it happens to me many other times, and I think that it has to do what your training and your knowledge, going to meetings, be attentive, learn what other people are doing, and get this information that at that time may not be useful to you, but then when you get all together, you may advance your research. And I think that it's very important. At this moment, I think that I have so much information. I wish I can give it to other people, because I've been 25 years in this field. So I really integrate things in a manner now that I don't think anyone else can do, because I have all the information. And probably that information is not in my papers, That's what I have so much. I really want to continue working in this field, and I am not thinking to retire, because I'm not going to retire because I think that it will be a disservice to the scientific community, particularly to young people who want to come into academia. I just finished and submitted the pharmacological review that summarized the work of the IUPAR nomenclature committee. it has been, when I sent it out, I said to my colleagues, I sent an email, I said, this has been a 10-year, 100-page project. Actually, it turned out to be 100-page manuscript and 10 years project because it has been so hard to summarize all that. But again, it's not all there. Well, the nomenclature, yes, it was controversial because, of course, everybody wants to have their saying and how the receptors are named. But I have to tell you that it was not my selection of name, and it was not the other selection of name. This was somebody decided that this was going to be the name. It was not us, and everybody agreed. So it was a very nice, and the name was not suggested by anyone in the committee. So so it was somebody from the executive committee of IUFAR that suggested that name, and everybody agreed because it was not controversial to anyone. I think that that's what the advances in the field happen when somebody from another discipline come to the biological rhythms. First, I made it into the retina field, and then second, I made it into the rhythms field, which are and the melatonin field, which are two rhythms that are unknown to me. I feel that I am a neuropharmacologist, and I think that rhythms are so important these days into neuropharmacology. As I tell my students, you can redo all the pharmacology that has been done in the last 50 or 100 years, because now you can do the same thing at a different time of day, and it's so important.
Very hard to convince pharmaceutical companies of that, though.
Well, they will have to be convinced because drug effectiveness depends on the time of day. What happens is pharmacology is a very hard discipline unless you're a pharmacologist, and people are afraid of those responses. Like they are afraid of the phase response curve, Are the same thing. Are the same thing.
Mention the phase response curve to a clinician.
Well, that's the thing. But what I tell them, a phase response curve is the same as a dose response curve. You change, in one you change the concentration, in the other you change the time. It's exactly the same thing. And goes up and down,
And then they're on board, though.
Yeah, that's when I gave a seminar into a pharmacology department or whatever. I do that, and then it's just I think that you need people from other areas, because if you don't need to bring people from other areas, and I think that I made the discoveries I made. I discovered that melatonin was inhibiting dopamine release in the retina because I didn't listen, I didn't know better, because people at that time were thinking that melatonin didn't have a receptor in mammals. So if I knew that, and if it came from another lab like Menaker or Joe Takahashi, they told me, how did you find this? There are no melatonin receptors in the retina.
If you don't know that it doesn't work, then
you go and try it.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. So.
I think that's so true.
Yeah.
Of all aspects of science.
Exactly.
There's a mindset which prevents people sort of getting out of this narrow track.
Yeah, and that's what I am doing now with my research in receptors and circadian rhythms. I'm trying to look things from a different angle, because if people are accustomed to accept things that big labs do, okay? Oh, Dubocovich did this, and Dr. Aren did this, and that's the dogma, So, but then if you come from a different way and you try to, see, everybody is at the end right, because I think that the difference between labs is due to the conditions and the experimental design, little differences. And it's not that the people do wrong things or publish something that is not true. At that particular time, they have something that they thought that was...
They believe that that's the
exactly.
Yeah.
But then if you look things from a different angle, is probably the way to make advances in research.